Hello and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast. Today, my guest is Isabel Wells, who's the director of Moon Rising Shamanic Institute. She's an active Shamanic Reiki Practitioner, a Reiki Teacher, and a spiritual coach. And last year, we did a podcast about chakras. It was amazing. I really encourage you to check that one out as well. But today, our topic is shamanism. And I'm so excited to explore this because she is so well versed in this topic and so well spoken. And she makes this such an easy concept to grasp. So a lot of people think that shamanism only comes from Siberia, but in fact, shamanism was developed in every major continent around the world at the same time with similar beliefs and similar practices. So we talk about core shamanism, what that is, and what are the threads that run through all shamanic practices. One of them is animism. We deep dive into that topic and explore what that's about. Another one is the shamanic consciousness versus ordinary consciousness. And the last is the three realms, the lower world, the middle world, and the upper world. We deep dive into this topic. It is packed full of juicy information. I'm so excited to share it with you. And I want to thank you so much for being here, and I hope you will enjoy. Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast, a place to explore possibility through mindfulness, movement, and self-discovery. Our intention is to deliver insight and inspiration while fostering conversations that are genuine, unfiltered, and deeply human. We hope you will enjoy today's episode. Hi, Isabel. Good morning and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be back.
I'm excited to have you back too. I loved our chat about chakras. I learned so much. If people haven't checked out that episode, it is so good. And yeah, you just like totally deep dive into chakras. And I think you give more information than most. And so if people haven't checked that out, I want to encourage them to do so. It's actually one of my favorite episodes. Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I love the chakras are so fascinating to me because they go so much deeper than what a lot of people think of when they think of the chakras. And I love having those conversations. So I'm really grateful we got to do that here on the show.
Me too. Me too. So I'm so happy to have you back. And I want to talk about shamanism today. And I love that we're talking about this because I think that there's a lot of buzz around this word. And some people have really positive connotations with it. And some people have really negative, or it's like a trigger word. And so can we just dive into what would be the definition of shamanism?
Oh, that's a great place to start. So, when we talk about shamanism, you're absolutely right. There are so many different perspectives around what shamanism really is. And something that I'm really passionate about in my own practice, as well as at the school that I teach with, Moon Rising Shamanic Institute, I'm really passionate about grounding in everything that we know about shamanism into the history and into the traditions of where shamanism developed. And what's fascinating about shamanism is a lot of times when we hear that word or we think of the practice, people tend to associate it with Siberia and this belief that shamanism only originated in Siberia. But what's really beautiful when we look at it from an anthropological perspective is that shamanism was actually developing in essentially every major continent in the world around the same time. And it's fascinating because it was a similar set of practices, a similar set of beliefs in these completely different geographical areas. So they had no connection to each other. And yet we see these similar strands weaving through shamanism. And when we're talking about, well, what exactly is shamanism, it's so hard to put a direct translation into what we're really looking at because it varies across cultures. So as shamanism was developing in these different locations, even though there are those similarities of the practice and the idea behind it, there were also a lot of really cultural specific aspects to it. And so, if you ask a shaman from Siberia versus a Native American shaman what their perspective on shamanism is, it's going to be very different. But when we boil it down and we boil it down to that common thread, right? That's always where I'm going to root this back into is what's that common thread that weaves its way through every shamanic tradition. And when we look at it that way, the answer is really that it's a branch of Animism. And so animism is a way of perceiving the world as alive. It's not a religion, it's more a way of perceiving the world. It's a way of life. And animists believe that everything in the world around them is alive. It's filled with spirit. So everything in the world, in nature, has that spirit, that consciousness, that energy, including the desk that your computer is sitting on, the cup that you're holding, the fox outside of your house, the cloud in the sky. Everything has energy and spirit. And they also, taking that one step further, really fully believe and walk the path of no hierarchy. So they really fully believe that humans are no better or worse than what is often called the other than human. So the plant spirits, the animal spirits, the rock spirits. And I love this starting place for shamanism because a lot of people are really familiar with the tree of life, right? That really beautiful, gorgeous symbol. And the tree of life is actually a really strong shamanic symbol. And what it was when we look at shamanism, and we'll explore this, I'm sure, a little bit more later, there are three primary spiritual realms that we explore in shamanism. There's the lower world, the middle world, and the upper world. And the tree of life was this symbol of how they're all connected. So the tree's roots begin in the lower world or in Mother Earth, Gaia.
Mhm.
And from that, it's this physical representation of spirit embodied, is what nature is from a shamanic perspective. And it grows into this tree. And as we start to see the tree's branches, each branch represented a different one of the major peoples or the different one of the major spirits. So the animal spirits, the rock spirits, the plant spirits, and the human spirits. And from there, from those main primary branches, it starts to branch out even further. So from the main trunk of animal spirit, then you get, the cats and the reptiles and the birds, and then it branches even further into the different species and the different specific birds, etc. And it happens that way with every major branch. And this was really how animists perceived the world, is not only is everything alive, not only does everything have spirit, but that spirit is flowing through all things in such a way that there is no better than or worse than. We are all here for reason and purpose. We are all part of this greater cosmic whole. And so we have as much to learn from the tree outside our window and the bird flying above our house as they do from us. We're all part of this grand cosmic play that's happening and swirling both within us and around us. And so that idea, that animist perspective, is really the foundation of every shamanic practice. And that's why we can say with a fair amount of certainty that a common definition for shamanism is the practice of applied animism. So when we see the world as alive, when we see everything as imbued with spirit, when we believe that there is no hierarchy, but we are all one in a really tangible way, how does that change our practice? How would we interact with nature if it was alive? How would we interact with nature and all of its elements if we truly believed that it was the divine embodied, if it was a physical manifestation of the divine? And that's where we start to get the shamanic practices, when we take the theory of animism and apply it to how we interact with the world.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I guess the thing that I have a little bit of trouble wrapping my head around is like how we're equal to a desk. Right? I can see like the plants and the animals and the things that are living that kind of have this cycle where I can see the cycle. But then when I think of man-made objects, I get a little bit stuck. So what would you say to that?
That's a great question. And it's probably one of the first things that our students say when they learn about animism is,
Mhm.
well, how is the desk? How is the desk on the same level? And I think this is where we also really have to understand the difference between shamanic consciousness and ordinary consciousness, which is typically the word that is used. And in shamanic consciousness, you are able to transcend your body and your mind. So when we are in our typical waking lives, right, our brain waves are hovering around alpha and beta, depending on what we're doing. We're very present. We're thinking our thoughts. We're a little more up in our heads, essentially, right?
Mhm.
And that's really what we would call ordinary consciousness, our day-to-day waking life, just kind of walking around. The shamanic practitioner or the shaman, if you're given that title by your tribe, is able to go deeper than that ordinary state of consciousness and into what they would call the shamanic state of consciousness. And so there have been amazing studies that have been done that actually show that this is really similar to a theta brainwave state. But they can essentially change their level of consciousness, change their level of perception so that they are not perceiving this physical world, but they are actually walking in the spiritual world.
Mhm.
And in that space, there isn't form, there isn't mass, there isn't separation from anything else. We are all starting at that base of the tree of life, essentially. It's this recognition that at the end of the day, when you strip back the layers, when you strip back the mind's labels and the form that we see here in physical 3D reality, everything is the same. Everything is one because we all come from that same energy, from that same consciousness and spirit. And so, although the manifestation in this physical form looks like our minds have a higher level of consciousness than an animal or a plant or a desk,
Yeah.
they're not looking at the mind. They're not looking at thoughts. They're not looking at consciousness the way that we think of consciousness. They're looking at the energy there and the beingness of what is in that desk. And so, we can loop this back into quantum physics, right? Where that's one of the first things we learn in chemistry is that the atoms are made of the protons, neutrons, and electrons. And of course, we have quarks and things in string theory now. But when we look at it at that basic level, we know from a scientific perspective that everything is energy, that when we break every single thing down, it doesn't matter if you're human or a plant or a desk, we're all made of that same energy at the end of the day. And the reason that this is so important from an animist perspective is it's not saying that the desk is going to have as developed thoughts as you are or be able to, for example, learn shamanic techniques the way that you could. It's not that level of consciousness.
Mhm.
It's this understanding that when we can walk in the shamanic state of consciousness, this physical representation, this physical form doesn't matter as much because there's this understanding that that energy at the end of the day is what connects all things. It is our true, with a capital T, form. And so we can see in the desk and in the plant and in the animal that we are all made of that same energy and spirit. It just happened to manifest differently in this reality. And again, if we kind of tie that back to quantum physics, this is where we can look at really what makes an element or an object what it is the arrangement of its electrons. It's just, what makes an apple different from an orange is how the electrons are arranged on, an atomic level. And what decides how those electrons arrange themselves, and this is where that theory of a divine consciousness comes in, of that energy is the same, but the divine intention, the divine consciousness for what it was going to become is what shaped it. And so we come from the same electrons, we come from the same energy, but our consciousness is what shapes us to, in this physical reality, be perceived as different from the desk or the animal or the plant. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. So, okay, just correct me if I'm wrong. So we're all one because we're all made up in the same kind of chemistry-ish way. But there's different levels of consciousness, and so in shamanism, we're not looking at those different levels of consciousness because at the baseline it's all the same.
Yeah, except there's a slight tweak to that, and you're absolutely on the right track. The slight tweak is that it's not so much levels. It's not this idea of we're more conscious than the desk. It's this idea of different.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite kind of origination stories that comes from shamanism is this idea that there was a time on Earth where the plants, the animals, the rocks, the humans spoke the same language. And I find this fascinating because you see that theme in a lot of other religions. Not that shamanism is a religion, but that's a theme that you see across a lot of different ideologies. This thought that at some point we all spoke the same language. And eventually we started seeing ourselves as separate. So instead of seeing ourselves as one with the grass, one with the rock, one with the animal, we started seeing ourselves as separate and as kind of the overseer of everything else. And it's that moment in our history. We can look at this again from an anthropological perspective and see that with the rise of civilization comes agriculture, comes the rise of religion. And that's really where this big separation comes, where now a lot of people can't even conceive of the fact that they would be even remotely similar to the blade of grass outside their window. But when we look at shamanism, when it originally developed, that was exactly how they felt. And oftentimes what we don't realize about shamanism is we kind of have this idea of the medicine man, right? The one that you bring the sick person to and they do some kind of spiritual woo-woo something and make you better, right? A lot of times that's what people get in their heads when they think of a shaman. But the biggest role that a shaman had was actually as the truth keeper for their tribe and for their culture. They were very acutely aware that what makes us is the stories we tell ourselves, both on an individual level and a collective level. And so oftentimes what would happen when you brought someone who was sick or experiencing discomfort to a shaman is they might, work with their power animal or go on a journey or do all of these things, but it was all in service to finding where did the story that you're telling yourself stop aligning with that capital T truth. And from a shamanic perspective, that capital T truth is that we are all one. We are one with all things. And so this is where we start to get into this really interesting side of shamanism, which is how do you apply this in modern daily life? Because the way that we make desks or cups or lamps is completely out of alignment with how you would create those things from an animist perspective. Because from an animist perspective, this piece of wood that made your desk had consciousness. It deserved the right to be asked what it wanted to be made into, if it was meant to stay connected to the land as a tree, or if it was meant and ready to become separate and be used. There was this idea that there was that consciousness there, and it's not the same as our mind's level of consciousness. Like it wasn't like they were having a conversation like we are now. But one of my favorite examples of this that I've found that almost everybody can relate to is if you're walking along a beach or on a stony path and you see a rock that you really, really like. Almost everybody that I have talked to understands that sometimes you pick up a rock and you know that it's not meant to come with you. It's supposed to stay there, and so you put it back. Whereas other times you pick up a rock and that one's okay. You get to bring that one home. And there's this instant connection. And this is, as far as I've been able to find, a universal experience. And it's a great example of animism, of this inner knowing that we have, that it's not like you exchanged a conversation with that rock and it said, no, I want to stay here. But it was this energetic knowing, again, coming back to that language before language, where we were able to connect with all things. And so, when we're sitting here talking about, well, am I on the same level as a desk? It's again this idea that from an animist perspective, there wasn't even the concept of levels to begin with. This
Yeah.
desk, as we made it now, would never have been made the way it was if we were living in alignment with animist principles. And so when it comes to walking in the modern world with animist eyes, it's a really interesting balance that I think is incredibly difficult to find. But it's about coming back into that understanding that we are all one. There is no separation, and that these aspects of modern life that we see that do feel so separate, like the way that we do mass production or the long work hours that we work, et cetera, are what, the original shamans would have deemed insanity, because it's so far, the stories that we're telling ourselves about what life looks like now is so far from the original instructions or that capital T truth for how we were meant to live in harmony with all things.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a beautiful perspective. And I feel like now there's so much duality and there's so much, there's that thinking of the levels, right? Even within people, not even like people to animals, like we're smarter than an ant or we have more consciousness than an ant. But I feel like there's a lot of what we're doing with other humans is creating this duality and this separation, which if you think about that, there's kind of a craziness around that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is also a really interesting place when we look at shamanic traditions of where that hierarchy came from. Because again, if we look at, and this is one of the things that I love about shamanism, is that when we're looking at the anthropological records of how humans as we know them came to be, shamanic practices are some of the very first that we see being practiced. And in fact, animism even predates shamanism, because again, we're going back to that definition that shamanism is applied animism. But this idea that the earth, that everything in this physical reality was alive and had spirit, is one of the very first solid formal thoughts that we see across cultures in time.
Mm.
And we can see this progression when we look at the record of how we began interacting with the earth. We can see this progression where there was a time where we really honored the earth and nature with a capital N and all of the spirits therein. And then we shifted into, okay, now how do we apply that? How do we work with the spirits? How do we work with nature? How do we live in harmony with this? Which is where we get a lot of our shamanic practices, knowing that our connection to nature is also a door to which we can access the divine. And from there, we start to see this really interesting shift when we start to look at, well, how can we make this essentially more efficient? Was often the question that kind of propelled all of this, as far as we can tell, right? And this is really where we start to see agriculture is really one of the first marks of separation, of this idea that, well, we could do it better, we could do it more, we could do it faster. AKA, we humans can do it better than the way that nature's doing it right now. And from that point, this is really where we start to see this big crumbling of the animist and shamanic perspectives, where we get agriculture and then we get civilization as we know it, and then we get religion. And what I find really fascinating about religion is, if we take probably the one that I'm assuming most of your listeners are going to be really familiar with, which is Christianity. In Christianity, you have heaven and hell and this physical 3D reality. That idea of the three spaces essentially actually comes from shamanic traditions. Because in shamanism, there was the lower world, which was the realm of nature, of Mother Earth. There was the upper world, which was the realm of the divine and of pure consciousness. And then there was the middle world, which is this realm in between. And there was never it wasn't even a hierarchy, actually. That idea of lower, middle, upper was something that came to the West with shamanism. But there were these three very separate realms that had their own energy and their own healing properties. And as we see agriculture and civilization and the rise of the idea of a hierarchy in how we live, we started to see the lower world become bad, the upper world become good. And this is where we also get in other religious thoughts the idea of transcending, of enlightenment, of going up and escaping this physical reality and going into it is bad. And this a lot of times is where, for many people who have some of those negative connotations around shamanism, this is actually where it originates, and they don't even know, because it was this idea that the shamans were working directly with nature. So rather than going up and out and trying to escape themselves or receive enlightenment or transcend, right? Instead of trying to go up to connect with the divine, they were going deeper in. They were going down to nature, down to Mother Earth, down to the lower world. And in our idea of hierarchy, going down is bad. And this is actually where that idea of hell, if we look at, again, the anthropological records, and this is not me saying in any way that Christianity is wrong and shamanism is right. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. I'm just kind of bringing light to the evolution that we see here from a historical perspective. That was really where the idea of hell originated from. Whereas from a shamanic perspective, the lower world was immensely healing. It was the energy of nature itself. It was the embodiment of everything that Earth had to offer. And it was an incredibly sacred space. And even just holding up those two perspectives is, I think, a really fascinating light to shine on the differences between how we perceived nature and consciousness and spirit then versus how we perceive it now.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Yeah. And I'm assuming, well, is it correct to say that in the shamanism that there is exploration of those three different worlds, the upper, the middle, and the lower?
Yes, absolutely. So when we look at shamanism, and again, up until this point, we've really been talking about the theory of shamanism, the things that we see that weave their ways through all of the different shamanic cultures and traditions, because there are so many. And, where that idea that shamanism originated in Siberia, it actually does have a little bit of truth, because the word shaman actually comes from it's a Manchurian Tungus word, saman, which was originated from a tribe in Siberia. So that's where we get the word shaman. But when we look across cultures and across geography and all of the different places that shamanic rituals and techniques were really being developed, they had many, many, many different titles. Shaman is just the one that we're the most familiar with. And there are those threads of theory and idea that we find in all of them. And at the same time, there are a lot of those cultural differences. So things like the medicine wheel, for example, some people might be familiar with the medicine wheel, or totem poles. Those are two aspects that originate from shamanic practice, but are very, very different depending on which culture you're viewing them from. So those are teachings that had a lot of variance across different locations and cultures. But what happened was, the reason that we can talk about shamanism here in the West and have it not be cultural appropriation, and this is a really important point that I do want to touch on, is in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was this anthropologist, Michael Harner, who embarked on a project to study indigenous cultures around the globe. And so he went into several different tribes across Peru, the Amazon, etc. And what started as this kind of anthropological study into how do these peoples live, what is their religion, as he called it at the time, they actually accepted him into their tribes and taught him the way of the shaman and gave him this express permission and instruction that you now have to take this and bring it back to the West. So he was brought into these tribes, these shamanic tribes around the globe, given express instruction that here are the shamanic ways, go take them back to the West. So already we kind of have this blanket permission slip, if you will, of bringing in these teachings and bringing them to the West. But what he did that was really fascinating, in addition to some of the other really prominent anthropologists we see from similar times, so people like Alberto Villoldo, Carlos Castaneda, Mircea Eliade, these really famous anthropologists were working together to bring all of this information back. And what they started to realize as they were compiling all of this is that there are practices, there are techniques that exist in every single shamanic culture across the globe. So not only is there this common idea of animism and what it means to connect with nature and spirit, but there are also these common practices that have developed out of the process of taking animism and making it a practical, applied experience. And so when we see this start to unfold, this is where we get the idea of core shamanism. And core shamanism was this group of teachings that were available and prominent in every single shamanic culture that these anthropologists had studied. And they were this set of techniques that they had been given express permission and instruction to bring back to the West to keep shamanism alive. And so some of the things that we see in these pillars, these aspects of core shamanism, are things like animism and shamanic versus ordinary consciousness. But we also see something called the shamanic journey. And so the shamanic journey is where we see this exploration of the lower, middle, and upper worlds. And what a shamanic journey was, is it was a shaman or a shamanic practitioner who had a drum beat going at about 240 beats per minute, which modern research studies have shown that that drum beat actually switches our brain into a theta brainwave state, i.e., this drum beat switched them into this shamanic state of consciousness. And from this almost trance-like state, their spirit, the shaman's spirit, was able to leave their body and explore these different realms. Because again, these realms aren't physical locations. It's not like you can go down a set of stairs and get to the lower world. It's a spiritual experience. It's an energy. And by going into the shamanic state of consciousness and allowing their spirit to explore the spirit world, the shaman could enter into the lower world, the middle, and the upper world, and be able to receive the healing and the connection and the insight that was there for them. And so in the lower world, this is where we see the idea of power animals come in, or spirit animals. We say, we kind of throw that out flippantly a lot in modern culture of, oh my gosh, that's my spirit animal. But for a shaman, a spirit animal was a messenger of the lower world. Essentially, it was an embodiment of the energy of nature. And so when you're in the lower world and you meet, say, a panther, it's not that you're meeting a singular panther. It is that you are meeting with panther with a capital P, the energy, the archetype, if you will, of panther. And so we find those nature spirits, our power animals, our spirit animals, in the lower world, as well as the healing energy of nature itself and the roots of that tree of life. When we go to the upper world, this is where we see what a lot of people know as our spirit guides, or our guardian angels, or our loving ancestors. Those are all in the upper world, this more ethereal space where it was divine consciousness. And this is where we see, again, that dichotomy a little bit of the lower world was earth and nature, and the upper world was spirit and consciousness. And when we come into the middle world, this space in between, it was this resting place, this meeting place. One of the primary stories that you hear about these three realms is that you had consciousness, you had spirit, you had all that is. And consciousness needs something to be conscious of. And so earth was created. And in that process of consciousness, of divine, being conscious of earth, they met and pulled apart. And it's from that meeting of the consciousness and what it's conscious of that created this middle world, this place that is the meeting point of physical 3D reality and energy. And so the middle world has two facets. It has this 3D reality that we're operating in right now, where that desk that we've been talking about all day exists and is physical and we can touch it. And it has the spiritual and energetic blueprint for this 3D reality. And so by going into a shamanic journey, the shaman could then connect with spirit, with nature, and with the energy of this reality that we're in a really tangible way to receive healing, to receive wisdom, to receive understanding that they could bring into the physical world to make a lasting difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Perfect. And so when would they go and seek wisdom from the upper world, and when would they go and seek wisdom from the lower world? Like, what are the animal spirits giving that's different than, say, the angel spirits or the spiritual advisors?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so this is, again, the idea of spirit helpers is something that is one of those pillars of core shamanism, something that we see across every shamanic culture and tradition. And the primary two that you see are power animals and teachers, or what we often call spirit guides. And so, again, power animals were in the lower worlds, and power animals were seen as these givers of power, right? That's why they're called power animals. Essentially, they were these energetic archetypes of, if you think of what comes to mind when you think of a panther, they're very strong, they're sleek, they're cunning, they're smart, they know when to hide, they know when to leap, they know when to attack. Versus a honeybee. A honeybee is really industrious and it works well as a group, but it knows how to get the job done and it's going to be a really hard worker. It's a very different energy. And so these power animals were able to lend us their energy in times of need. So if we were in a physical situation where we needed strength or we needed protection, we might call on panther or bear. Again, knowing that we're calling on panther with a capital P, bear with a capital B, we're calling on the energetic archetype of these animals. And they were also seen as these bringers of protection and grounding and stability. So oftentimes in shamanic cultures, when you became a shaman or a shamanic practitioner, you were matched with your specific power animal helper. And this power animal was an energy that would be with you in all of your healing work that essentially kind of filled in the spaces where maybe you weren't as strong. So you might be really, really rooted and grounded and present in how you think as a shamanic practitioner, but you might not be as good in, let's say, physical strength, right? These are really loose examples. And so your power animal would be an animal or an archetype that had that strength that maybe you didn't have as much of. And so they were this energy that came together with the shaman to create this perfect energetic balance and harmony while offering protection and guidance. And so you would go to the lower world when you needed that power or that energy to be with you. Versus our teachers in the upper world, our teachers are often the easiest for people who aren't familiar with shamanism to understand because they really are like spirit guides. They were these energetic beings that were considered extensions of the divine, extensions of spirit that had specific messages and wisdom and insights to be able to give us. And so they were really here to, the way that we kind of explain it in modern words that most people can kind of click with, is that they were here to keep us true to our soul's intentions for this lifetime. So they were here to keep us in alignment with the divine, in alignment with spirit. And so I like to say that our spirit guides are a little bit like frequency holders. They're kind of like tuning forks. When we go and meet our spirit guide, they're going to tell us, where is your frequency wonky? Where have you fallen off the path? Where aren't you in alignment with the divine anymore? And they're also this very uplifting, healing, ethereal energy. But they're also here to teach you lessons. So whereas your power animals are really there to help you and guide you and give you protection and support, your teacher and your spirit guide was there to teach you. So they're going to tell you the things that you're not seeing. They're going to redirect you on your path if you start to stray. They're going to be the ones that when you embark on the shamanic path are there to teach you what it means to walk that path. They're a lot more involved often, although their energy is more ethereal and uplifting. And so those are the two primary ones that we see in that core shamanic perspective.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yes. And so what is the perspective on dreams?
That's a great question. So dreams from a shamanic perspective happen in the middle world. And so this is where, I think a lot of your audience is familiar with Reiki when we do distance Reiki or distance energy healing. From a shamanic perspective, that's happening in the middle world because, again, the middle world is both this physical 3D reality, but also the energetic, spiritual backbone of it, the spiritual counterpart of it, if you will. It's a little tale of two cities, but if the second city was made of energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're dreaming from a shamanic perspective, that is when our soul is freed from the constraints of the mind and it can go walk with the spirits in the middle world. And so there is a little bit of this is where shamanism is really fascinating to me as someone who has a background in psychology, because there are very clearly times where, if I'm sleeping and I'm dreaming about work and what I have to do, that's clearly not my soul traversing the spirit realm. That's very clearly my mind processing. And so there are times where we have dreams that are just our minds processing and our energy processing things. But from a shamanic perspective, the dreams where our soul is kind of roaming free are what we call big dreams. And these are dreams where, you wake up and it was this whole story that had this huge pivotal impact on you. Or maybe there was a really important character. A lot of times your power animal will show up in your dreams. A lot of times your spirit guide will communicate with you in your dreams. And so it's not that every single dream that you have, your soul is having this magical experience in the middle world. But when you have those dreams where you wake up and you can tell, I don't know where I was last night, but it wasn't here.
Yeah.
That's what, from a shamanic perspective, we would call a big dream, that it had this spiritual importance because your soul was able to go out and explore and bring new wisdom back in.
Yeah. I mean, I partly asked that because I had this bizarre dream last night about snakes. And so I'm thinking snakes, I'm thinking lower world, but it was this bizarre, and it was happening in the house. Like I had these snakes in a cage and I'd forgotten about them and I'd forgotten to feed them. And I went to check on them and one of them was like emaciated. And then the snake, I like turn around, there's like little snakes and I'm like, how am I going to feed? How am I going to feed and keep all these alive? And then I see this like giant anaconda like snake, huge, big fat thing eating this other snake. And I was like horrified. And I'm thinking, oh my God, these snakes are so massive. They're going to like break out of this cage. I don't know, eat the cat. And then there were also all these little babies. And I was like, how am I going to feed all the little babies? How am I going to take care of them? It was the most bizarre dream. But in my mind, I'm thinking that's lower world and snakes come up a lot for me in my dreams. And so when things like that come up, it's like, how do we even make sense of them sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. This is where, and this is part of why I love shamanism as, again, it's not a religion, it's a way of living life and perceiving the world, is that it is always going to come back to, and what was your experience? What did that mean for you? There isn't this set of 10 steps to achieving enlightenment, or this is what that dream means. There are foundations that we can use to understand that, a lot of times when we look at snake, it's this spiritual archetype of feminine energy, and noticing how, they were eating each other and feeding on each other. And some of them were starving and some of them were itty bitty tiny and some of them were huge. And what does that say about your feminine energy in your life? Whether that's just the feminine energy in yourself or in your community, since there were so many of them. Why were some of them in a cage? What is that symbolism for you? And so this is where the role of the shaman becomes not to say, here's your answer, go be better. It's bringing you into this space where you can ask those honest questions and recognize, what was that meaning? What was that healing for you? Because from a shamanic perspective, that would be called a big dream, right? Clearly, snake is communicating something with you. And so we get to play in the realm of metaphor and symbolism, of noticing what that snake means, not only as an archetype of that feminine energy and, the Kundalini awakening that we see going along the spine through your chakras, but also in your own life. What symbolism does snake have for you? And then what did, the symbolism of what was happening to the snakes mean? So that imbalance of the sizes and that some were starving and some were really hungry. It's like what aspects of that feminine energy are being overfed or trying to kind of take over versus which ones are starving and not being nourished as well. And why were the starving ones the ones in the cage while the others were allowed to roam free? And so it becomes this really fascinating, almost like a puzzle where you get to look at, and this is where I think that difference between ordinary consciousness versus shamanic consciousness really shines through, because our mind is going to want it to be, well, it's a snake, so it means this. Or it was in a cage, so it means I'm in a cage. But it's not. It's what was the meaning? What was the metaphor? And I think that's one of the biggest draws to shamanism for so many people is it's not about the experience itself. It's not about the dream. It's not about the journey. It's not about what you saw. It's about what meaning did you pull from it? And how are you then going to integrate it into your daily life? And so those dreams hold a lot of meaning, but part of learning how to walk the shamanic path is learning how to interpret those signs and the symbolism and be able to apply it to your own life so you can pull that meaning from it. Because the other perspective of this is that spirit is always going to be respecting your autonomy. Like it can come and give you lessons and messages and prompts all day, but it's not here to spoon feed us, if that makes sense. Like I think a lot of people want meditations to be you meditate and you get this aha moment and you're done. And sometimes it is like that. But a lot of times what we find when it comes to our power animals or to our dreams or to spirit guides is that they tell us the things that are going to help us walk the path. Meaning they're not going to tell us the things that are going to let us sit where we are and just have the knowledge. They're going to be here to push us along, to help us learn, to help us come back into connection with all things. And that sense of connection requires that effort and that insight and that openness on our part. And so there's a reason that it's called, the shamanic path, because it's not a one size fits all answer. Even though we do see these pillars of core shamanism, it really is coming back to how can we pull out that meaning for you? How can we see the symbolism? How can we understand the lesson, the meaning in all of this and apply it to your own life?
And then I'm assuming too that it's your relationship to that object in the dream or that thing in the dream. So like some people might love snakes and some people might be terrified with them. And so that plays a role in it too. Or also the feeling that you have when you wake up from that dream, if you feel terrified or if you feel relieved. So it's looking at all the different aspects, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's really looking at it as this understanding that it is this multifaceted experience that you're having. And so, again, not only, like I was saying, is it that archetype of snake, but what does snake mean for you? How did it make you feel? How did the dream overall make you feel? Because that can offer a lot of insight into the meaning for you, because snake is going to mean something completely different for you than it would for me, right?
Yeah.
And again, that's the beauty of it, is it is applied animism. So it's how can we take this understanding that everything is alive and apply it to our own lives, to our own consciousness, to find the meaning for where we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and so the aspects of core shamanism, one is animism, the other one is the three different realities, right? The upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. And are there any other within core shamanism that are across the board for all shamanic practices?
Yeah. So, like you said, we see animism, we see the shamanic consciousness versus ordinary consciousness. And I did forget to mention this, and I want to put it in because I think it's important, is that to a shaman, to a shamanic practitioner, what happens when you're in the state of shamanic consciousness is just as real as what happens in ordinary consciousness. So, to a shamanic practitioner or a shaman, and the reason that I make that differentiation is that when we're looking at the word shaman, it was this title of respect. You would never call yourself a shaman. You would never claim to be a shaman. It was a title of respect given to you by your tribe that came after months, sometimes years of initiation and training. And so I do want to be really clear in that I do not call myself a shaman. I do not see myself as a shaman. I am a shamanic practitioner because I am learning how to walk the path, and I have done the learning and the education through those lineages, but that is not a title that I have been given or honored with. And so I'm a shamanic practitioner.
Yeah.
But
Well, I actually really appreciate that too, because I think it's a trigger for me when people like self-proclaim themselves as a shaman. Um, and then I think there is the shamanic practices, which in theory are accessible to everybody, and everyone has access to them, and everyone has those abilities. And yet there's people, yes, that are calling themselves self-proclaimed shamans. And then that's where the triggering comes in, right?
yeah,
For me and for other
absolutely.
people, I think.
And I think that's another line where we really toe that cultural appropriation line, because when we're practicing core shamanism, right? We're practicing that lineage where these teachings were, kind of given permission to be brought to the West. And there are these things that we see across all cultures, meaning that they are inherent to the way that human beings connect with nature and spirit. If these practices that we'll kind of explore in a second, if these practices are showing up across time, across space, no matter the culture, the geographical location, any of it, that means that they are inherent. They are innate ways that we as humans connect to nature and connect to spirit. And so therefore they are our birthright, because we are nature. The difference is when we start to pull on the cultural thread. So we have animism, which is that universal thought. We have core shamanism, which are those innate ways that we connect with nature and spirit. But then we have the cultural applications of shamanic practices. And when we start to pull on those is where we step into cultural appropriation. Because before we were exploring our natural innate tendencies to be nature, to be connected to spirit. But when we start to pull on, for example, one culture's perspective of a totem pole or the medicine wheel or calling ourselves a shaman, that's when we're kind of plucking those strings of cultural appropriation, because those were very culturally specific experiences that, unless we were raised in that culture or in that tribe or invited in by members of that tribe, we have no right to. Those are not accessible if we're truly staying in that realm of core shamanism, of how to
Mm-hmm.
innately connect to nature and spirit. And so that doesn't mean that there aren't shamans. There are. But if we're looking at something that is truly a self-proclaimed shaman, they haven't been given that title by a
Mm-hmm.
tribe, it's not culturally invited or honored to them, then that is a mark of someone who, from my perspective, is not truly practicing shamanism, because there is a very clear respect and understanding that that title is something to be honored. And just because you practice these techniques, just because you walk in the shamanic realms, does not make you a shaman. And I'm in my personal practice, I'm very passionate about integrity and authenticity and really understanding where are our roots, what is our birthright and what isn't. And that title is not a right. It is a gift, it is a blessing, and it's something
Mm-hmm.
that very few people are truly given. And I think that to call ourselves shamans is taking away from not only the cultural sacred nature of that title, but also from those individuals who have rightfully been given that title through so many years of initiation and training.
Mm-hmm. Wow, you just spoke that so eloquently, and that's so important. It's so important, that differentiation and that cultural appropriation piece of it, and you spoke that so beautifully. Wow, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in that, so as we're trying to kind of stay in our lane here of core shamanism, and again understanding that these natural innate ways of connecting with spirit and nature are our birthright, because they just are. When we are looking at the world from an animist perspective and we understand that we are nature and we are spirit, and so is everything else on earth, that is our birthright of how would we interact with the world if that's how we saw the world. And so we see animism, we have the shamanic consciousness and the ordinary consciousness. And like I was saying earlier, that is where, if you go to the lower world and you saw a panther, the shaman or the shamanic practitioner will tell that story, quote unquote, as if it happened in 3D reality. So they would say, I saw a panther today and it ate my eyes and set me on fire and then replaced me back into my body. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason that I'm saying this is because there's this really beautiful anthology of the history of shamanism that I'm reading right now. And you can tell that the author doesn't understand that, because there are aspects of when they're talking about the initiation rituals where, it's a really common thing in a journey for shamans to have limbs torn off or eyes gouged out or things in a journey as part of that rite of your body being completely cleansed and put back together. And the shaman and the shamanic practitioner is going to tell that story as if it happened, because from that perspective, what happens in the spirit realm is just as real and vivid and tangible and true as what happens in the ordinary realm. And this is, I think, the difference between those two levels of consciousness is probably something I could do an entire podcast about. But those differences are another aspect of core shamanism, as are the three shamanic realms and the process of shamanic journeying, as are our spirit helpers, so our power animals and our teachers. We also see vibrational healing as one of those pillars. So we see that drum beat is something that is in every shamanic culture, as well as something called power songs, which was a song that was specific to the shaman or the shamanic practitioner that kind of held the frequency of their soul or of their healing work. So we see vibrational healing. We also do see the four directions and the medicine wheel across cultures, but the way that they're presented varies. So that's one of those practices that toes the line a little bit, because every culture has the idea of east, south, west, and north being these primary directions that we're working with, that have energy and have spirit, and we place those into the medicine wheel so that we can work with them. But the way that they're represented and the way that we use the medicine wheel does vary from culture to culture. But we also see the other two pillars that we see in core shamanism are vision quests and pilgrimages. So vision quests were the Spark Notes version is that a vision quest was the process of putting yourself out in nature. Often it was on top of a mountain or deep in the forest, without food, without water, for a number of days or weeks. And it was called a hamblecha ceremony. And that means crying out for a vision. You were putting yourself out in solitude, in isolation, in direct connection with nature and with spirit, and you were crying out for a vision, crying out for help, for insight, for what aren't you seeing. And this was often something that if you went to see a shaman, they would send you on a vision quest, because again, we're looking for where are the stories that we're telling ourselves not aligned with those capital T truths. And one of the best and most poignant ways to do that is to go on a vision quest where you're not hearing it through the lips of a shaman, you're getting it directly from nature and directly from the divine. And I actually had the honor of participating in a vision quest last year, and it was an incredibly life-changing experience. But that idea of we're going to go out in nature, we're going to put ourselves in isolation, fasting, connecting with the divine, and crying out for a vision, crying out for an understanding that we don't have, is something that we see in every shamanic tradition. As well as the idea of soul retrieval. And so soul retrieval was this idea that when something incredibly difficult or traumatic happens in this life, a piece of our soul can break off or separate. And sometimes we need to go on a shamanic journey and do the shamanic practice to retrieve that part of our soul and feel whole again. And so those are the pillars that we see in core shamanism. And of course, everyone is such an in-depth conversation that I really do think we could probably have a conversation about each one, but those are the foundation of a shamanic practice.
Yeah. Wow. And I feel like I remember from the past you sharing that plant medicine journeys, no matter what method of plant medicine, if it's ayahuasca or psilocybin, those are all middle world journeys. Is that correct?
Yes. And what's fascinating about this is that the use of plant medicine is something that we actually do see vary across cultures. So some shamanic cultures will use plant medicine to go on a shamanic journey. So they will take the plant medicine to assist their soul in traversing the spirit realm. And some don't. Some purely just do the journey with the drum beat. And so there is some variance there. But the way that we often see plant medicine journeys done today, where we're in, an ayahuasca circle, or I know you just did your combo certification. So in those kinds of ceremonies, those experiences that we have with plant medicine, as we often know them today, happen in the middle world, because again, they're taking us into the energetic representation of all that is. Whereas when a shaman would take plant medicine and go journey, there is an actual, it's not physical, but there's a spiritual descent into the lower world, and there's a spiritual ascent into the upper world. It was a very clear difference in where they were going, it took a lot of training to be able to do a true shamanic journey and to become what they would call a hollow bone, so that when you went into the journey, you were leaving behind your mind, you were leaving behind your personality, your thoughts, your beliefs, everything that you were, so that you could be filled with spirit. Whereas often what we see in plant medicine journeys today that are absolutely beautiful is we bring ourselves into it, right? We go into the plant medicine to be able to know more about ourselves, to be able to heal ourselves, to be able to find that transmutation and then come back and integrate it into our daily lives. So the intention there is slightly different, but they're both incredibly healing experiences.
I mean, from what I'm hearing you say is that we're bringing our ego into the medicine journeys, where the shamans that have been skilled and practiced at this kind of check their egos and check their minds behind, and then they go on a journey without thought, without like duality.
A little bit. Yeah. I personally think that there's a lot of negative connotation around the word ego. I personally don't like to use the word ego because I think it
Yeah.
immediately places that blame of, oh, you brought your ego into your plant medicine journey. And that's
Yeah.
not at all what I'm saying. What I mean is that when we go into a plant medicine journey, right, we go in to discover ourselves more, essentially, right? However we phrase that, for some people, the intention's different. But that idea is that we are going on the journey,
Like
us as
I.
a person. Exactly.
And
I.
and that's what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of ego, but I do hear that it has a negative connotation. But I'm thinking of ego as in the sense of self.
The sense of self. Yeah, absolutely. So in a plant medicine journey, you're bringing that I along. Whereas in a shamanic journey, when you're doing a true shamanic journey, you aren't going anywhere.
Right.
You are staying here. It's the spirit, it's the soul, it's the essence
Yeah.
that's going on the journey. And that's part of why it's such a different experience, and why it did take so much training to be able to perform a journey in that way, because it was that idea of clearing yourself out first. Whereas a lot of times in plant medicine journeys, we do bring that I along, and it is an incredibly healing experience. I'm not trying to say otherwise
Right.
at all. Yeah.
Oh, that totally makes sense. Yes. Wow, Isabel. Thank you. I feel like, is there anything major that we've missed? Because I feel like there's so much, and I could deep dive into any branch of this tree.
I know, and I love shamanism, and this is something where I teach. In all, we have a 12-month course series teaching shamanism, and even then it would be impossible to know it all. So it would be impossible to get all of it into an hour-long podcast. But I think my encouragement, what I would love to leave listeners with, is this understanding that so much of what we see, what we hear as shamanism today is neo-shamanism. It's shamanism that's been kind of taken and put into the lens of modern spirituality, which can be incredibly healing, and a lot of people find comfort and truth in it. I personally have found a lot of solace and comfort and truth in coming back to our roots, in coming back to what was shamanism originally intended to be. When we go back to before the hierarchy, before the better than, worse than, before the idea that up was good, down was bad, before all of that, when we look at pure animist perspective and how we can apply that to create a shamanic practice, that is really where the most powerful healing comes in. Because once again, shamanism at its core, no matter which branch we're practicing or how we perceive it, shamanism is our ability to connect with nature with a capital N, to spirit with a capital S, and to ourselves, ourself with a capital S. And when we can do that, it completely transforms the way that you perceive the world. And I find that especially right now, for those of us in the States who are experiencing a lot of heavy energy right now, coming into connection with animist perspective, perceiving nature as your friend instead of your enemy, understanding that you are never alone from a spiritual perspective, can be incredibly comforting and incredibly healing. And so, I think that would be my invitation to listeners of what's the first step is just go outside, and as silly as it sounds, go sit under a tree. Find a tree that calls to you. It doesn't matter if it's big, if it's little, if it's skinny, if it's fat, it doesn't matter. Find a tree that calls to you. Sit down, put your back to it, and just listen. Just notice, how does your body shift? How does your energy shift? How do your thoughts shift? If you let yourself be quiet and rest there, does a thought that wasn't yours come into your mind, and what does it say? What's the meaning there? Let yourself be held by nature for even just 10 minutes. And just notice, do you feel differently? And if you do, maybe that's your invitation to explore shamanism even further, to connect with nature even more. And if that's something that you're interested in, I am always more than happy to have conversations, to do a session, to do one-on-one mentorships or trainings. So know that I am a resource that's available. There are absolutely amazing books and other schools out there as well. But it always starts with that first, again, that direct experience of, can we get you the experience of believing that you are connected to nature? And our trees are some of our strongest and most powerful teachers. So go find a tree, go sit under it for 10 minutes, even if you feel silly,
Yeah.
and just see what happens.
Beautiful. Thank you. And how do people find you, and what are some of the offerings? And I definitely put it in the show notes as well.
Beautiful. Yeah. So I'm the director of Moon Rising Shamanic Institute. So we're a shamanic school that hosts a variety of different trainings. So you can find us at moonrisinginstitute.com. We have our primary offering, which is a 4-month Soul Rising Shamanic Reiki course, where we're blending shamanism as well as chakras, which I shared about in my previous episode on the show, with Reiki healing and so much more. That then goes into our 4-month practitioner program and our 4-month advanced mentorship. So if you choose, you could do up to a year of training with us in the shamanic path. In addition, I offer one-on-one mentorships in shamanism, in Reiki, in chakras. I also have a background in psychology and neuroscience and quantum physics and nursing, and so I love bringing in all of those aspects as well. I offer healing sessions as well if you're interested in doing something one-on-one, but not in such a long container. And I am also a student homeopath, so if you're interested in learning more about alternative healing and holistic health, please feel free to message me. Like I said, you can find us at moonrisinginstitute.com. From there, you can send me a message directly. I would also love to see you over in our Shamanic Mystics Facebook group. It's a community of over 4,000 amazing individuals who are all walking this path and doing this work together. So you can come join us there. We also have our own podcast called Wisdom Rising, and you can find that on any platform that you listen to podcasts on. And of course, we share all of those resources in that Facebook group as well. So we would love to see you in any and all of the places and spaces. And if you want to reach out to me directly, you can email me at isabel@moonrisinginstitute.com. I would love to connect and chat, and maybe even hear your top takeaway from today's episode. No pressure or commitment or needing to do anything extra, but I would love to hear what your top takeaway was, and if you're interested in applying shamanism and how your experience with your tree went.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Isabel. I appreciate you so much. I'm so happy to have you back on the podcast again, and I'm loving everything that you shared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Connected Community Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I can be found at www.nickyyoga.com, NICKYYYOGA.com. Until I see you again next week, I hope you have a beautiful day.